What makes a person question everything they believed in? Why would someone who wrote America's greatest novel feel like a complete failure? What happens when you discover that the American dream might be nothing but an illusion? These are the questions that haunted Herman Melville, a man who seemed to have it all: early success as a writer, a loving family, and recognition in New York's literary circles. But beneath this surface of achievement lay a mind tortured by doubt and a soul searching for deeper truth. This is the story of Herman Melville, the writer who gave us Moby Dick, but whose life became a battle against the very ideals that America held dear. A man who started his career writing popular adventure stories about exotic places, only to end up questioning everything about his society, success, money, faith, and the American way of life itself. His journey from celebrated author to forgotten critic of American society, and finally to a man who found unexpected truth in his failures, is one of the most fascinating stories in American literature. It's a tale that shows us how sometimes the greatest insights come from losing everything you thought mattered. Today, we're going to explore the extraordinary journey of a writer who dared to look behind the curtain of American society. While his masterpiece, Moby Dick, sits on library shelves worldwide today, Melville died thinking he was a failure, never knowing that his works would later be seen as some of the most important critiques of American life ever written. This is more than just a story about a writer. It's about someone who discovered that the path to truth sometimes means questioning everything you've been taught to believe. And through his struggle, we might just learn something about our own search for meaning in a world that often values success over truth. Herman Melville's story begins in New York City in 1819, born into what seemed like a life of promise and privilege. His father was a successful merchant who gave his family everything they could want. But life had other plans. When Herman was just 12 years old, his father's business failed completely. Shortly after, his father died, leaving the family with nothing but debts and broken dreams. This early taste of how quickly the American dream could turn into a nightmare left a deep mark on young Herman. To help his family survive, he had to leave school and work all sorts of jobs, from bank clerk to teacher, but it was his decision to become a sailor at age 20 that would change everything. In 1841, Melville signed up as a crew member on a whaling ship called the Acushnet. This wasn't a pleasure cruise, it was hard, dangerous work. But it was also his ticket to adventure and his first step toward becoming a writer. During his time at sea, he experienced things that most New Yorkers could only dream about. He lived among Pacific Islanders, met all kinds of interesting sailors, and even took part in a mutiny on one ship. When he came back home and started writing about his adventures, people couldn't get enough. His first book, Typee, told exciting stories about living with island natives in the South Pacific. It was an instant hit. Readers loved his tales of exotic places and adventures. His second book, Omu, was just as successful. At just 27 years old, Herman Melville had become one of America's most popular writers. He seemed to have it all again. Money was coming in, he married a judge's daughter named Elizabeth Shaw, and the newspapers praised his every word. He bought a nice farm in Massachusetts, started a family, and became friends with other famous writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne. This was the American dream in action, a young man who had lost everything, gone to sea, and written his way to success. But something was starting to change inside Melville's mind. The more he wrote, the more he began to see past the simple adventure stories that had made him famous. He started to question things about America, about success, about what people really wanted from their writers. And this questioning would lead him down a path that would change everything, though not in the way anyone expected. Everything changed when Melville started writing Moby Dick. What began as another adventure story about whaling turned into something much deeper and darker. As he wrote, he couldn't stop thinking about the big questions that were bothering him. He began to see that the simple stories people wanted about brave Americans having adventures and getting rich weren't telling the whole truth about life. His mind became filled with troubling thoughts. He saw how his society was obsessed with money and success, but he also saw how empty these things could be. He watched as his fellow Americans chased wealth like Captain Ahab chased the white whale, destroying themselves in the process. These thoughts started keeping him up at night, making him question everything he'd written before. Writing became harder. He'd spend hours staring at blank pages, trying to find words for the dark truths he was discovering. His wife Elizabeth noticed the change in him. The cheerful storyteller was disappearing, replaced by a man who would pace around their farm for hours, lost in troubled thoughts. He started having terrible headaches. Some days he could barely get out of bed. When Moby Dick was finally published in 1851, people didn't know what to make of it. They'd expected another exciting adventure story. Instead, they got a book full of deep questions about life, power, and the dark side of the American dream. The reviews were harsh. Sales were terrible. It was like Melville had committed career suicide. But he couldn't go back to writing simple stories anymore. He tried with his next book, Pierre, but it came out even darker and stranger. This one was about a young man who discovers his whole life is built on lies, much like how Melville felt about American society. The book was a complete failure. His publisher even refused to pay him for it. If you're finding this journey interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to follow more stories like this one. The money stopped coming in. His family started struggling. The famous friends who used to visit stopped coming around. Melville found himself in the worst position for a writer. He finally had something important to say, but nobody wanted to hear it. He had looked too deeply into the darkness of the American dream, and it was costing him everything. Like a ship lost at sea, Melville began searching desperately for answers. He tried different ways to deal with his crisis, each one showing him something new about the truth he was seeking. First, he tried to go back to writing what people wanted. He published short stories in magazines, trying to recreate his early success, but it felt like putting on an old coat that didn't fit anymore. The words felt hollow, and his heart wasn't in it. He knew there was no going back to being the simple storyteller he once was. Then, he turned to poetry, spending hours writing verses about war, nature, and the human spirit. He thought maybe if he changed how he wrote, he could finally express what he was seeing about American society. But his poems, like battle pieces, found few readers. The truth he was trying to share was still too uncomfortable for most people to hear. He even tried taking a job as a customs inspector in New York, working on the docks where he used to begin his sailing adventures. For 19 years, he watched ships come and go, seeing how America's hunger for wealth and goods never seemed to end. Every day, he saw both the promise and the pain of the American dream, rich merchants getting richer, while poor sailors and workers struggled to survive. During these years, Melville kept writing, but now he wrote mainly for himself. He filled notebooks with thoughts about what he saw, the gap between rich and poor, the emptiness of success, the way people fooled themselves into thinking money could solve all their problems. But these writings stayed hidden away, like a secret diary of America's dark truths. The most surprising thing about Melville's journey is that his greatest discovery came not from finding success, but from accepting failure. As the years passed, something unexpected happened. He found a kind of peace in being forgotten. Away from the pressure of fame and success, Melville finally understood something important: the American dream that everyone was chasing, the idea that anyone could get rich and be happy if they just worked hard enough, was itself part of the problem. It was a story people told themselves to avoid facing harder truths about life. In his last novel, Billy Budd, written shortly before his death but not published until 1924, Melville showed that he'd found a different kind of truth. Instead of writing about chasing success or fighting against society, he wrote about simple human goodness facing a complex world. The story wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about understanding and accepting life as it really is. What's amazing is that Melville died in 1891 thinking he was a failure, having sold barely any copies of his books for years. He couldn't have known that decades later, people would rediscover his works and realize he had seen truths about America that were ahead of his time. His books, especially Moby Dick, would be recognized as masterpieces that showed both the bright and dark sides of the American dream. His greatest discovery turned out to be something that went beyond success or failure. The understanding that real truth often lies in looking past what society tells us is important, and finding our own way to make sense of the world. What can Melville's story teach us today? Here was a man who started by chasing the American dream, only to discover that the real treasure wasn't in success at all. It was in seeing life as it truly is, even when those truths are uncomfortable. His journey shows us something important. Sometimes what looks like failure on the outside can actually be a doorway to deeper understanding. While his society wanted simple success stories, Melville chose to tell harder truths. He lost fame and fortune because of this choice, but he gained something more valuable: the freedom to see and write about life honestly. Today, we still chase success like Captain Ahab chased his white whale. We still tell ourselves the same stories about getting rich and being happy. But Melville's life reminds us to ask ourselves, what are we really chasing? And what truths might we be avoiding in our rush to succeed? Maybe the real meaning of Melville's life isn't in the fact that he was eventually proved right, or that his books finally found their readers. Maybe it's in showing us that true wisdom sometimes comes from being brave enough to question what everyone else takes for granted. What questions do you need to ask about your own life? What truths are you ready to face?